All in all, the difference between ordinary people and the real revolutionist is that ordinary men accept life as being something other than themselves. My good old equation. Is that big enough to see on film? You remember the old equation, right? Ordinary people, again, were I to get their attention in some way and draw this equation and say something about it, ordinary people believe that they would see themselves quite clearly in that equation, see themselves as I, and they would also believe that quite clearly they see the not I part clear enough, and they see it clearly as being something other than themselves. That if there is any validity, or whatever it may be, the validity of the equation, whatever may be its ultimate use, at least prima facie they can see this part, that surely there is an I know what you mean, and there's a not I. They are separate, and I is not I. There's clearly a distinction, but I start out pointing out to you that there is also another distinction. And the distinction is the difference between ordinary people and the real revolutionists, because it's only the ordinary people that believe that shit. That there is clearly a difference between me and not me. That there is a difference between I and what seems to be my existence. That clearly life is something other than themselves. The revolutionists would know better than that. I could give you a variation and say, instead of me writing it, assume instead of everything it says, I plus my problems equal my life. All right, I'll do it. I plus my problems equal my life. Now again, ordinary people would believe that they quite clearly see what I intend, whatever may be its ultimate value, if any, but they would believe that they see quite clearly that, yeah, this is true. Taking the way in which I have presented the equation, that I, in their case, themselves, is absolutely separate from and external to their problems. It has to be. Were it not true, there'd be no use for a priest, for a rabbi, for a psychiatrist. There'd be little use for confederates, beer drinking buddies. What would you have to talk about? What would you have to confess? What case would you have to plead? What would you have to rectify if it were not correct that your problems were separate from you? That if it were not true that problems were external to you? It seems to be no doubt that if one man says my problem is my relationship with my mate, or a woman says the same thing, my problem is I do not have enough money, my problem is I feel less than qualified to be a Homo sapien. All of that appears to be, without any doubt, external problems. With ordinary people, that's all right. As long as that is the belief, you need to see that things will remain stable in life and resistant to any change. Whereas if you listen very quickly, it would, from a 3D view, would appear to be otherwise. That ordinary people would be those people who would have at least any possibility of affecting change, because they see, hey, there's me and then there's my problems. And it's everybody from Siggy Freud to Phil Donahue would now tell you, listen, you've got to deal with your problems. You've got to learn to communicate with your problems. You've got to get in touch with your problems. You've got to become familiar with your problems. You've got to be able to put your hands on your problems, take them into the hot tub with you. You've got to be able to do something with your problems to be able to deal with them, to come to grips with them. And the audience says, amen, even though on Donahue they may not say amen. They whisper amen in their little hearts. So it would appear that those people would be the ones with the potential to change, right? And of course you know that's not right. It would have to be the extremely powerful, those driven by a sense of revolution, who can even begin to face such apparently 3D pessimistic information and accept it nonchalantly, because it is nonchalant information. Anything that's true, anything that you begin to see another dimension to it, that you can see the part, or begin to suspect the part that's missing, the part of the loop that goes outside 3D consciousness, then all information, no matter how apparently shocking, disruptive, insane it may be in the beginning, you can eventually take it as being nonchalant. I could throw in still a 3D aside and point out to you rhetorically, what's your choice? It's only the ordinary that get upset at the inevitable. But as long as there is the feeling that I and my problems are external to one another, that they are separated by this plus sign, they are simply separated. There is a difference between I and my problems. As long as there is that sensation, as long as your systems are still wired up and fueled on that basis, I want you to understand that your life and the greater life of humanity inside of life remains very stable, and to say the very least, it remains extremely resistant to any change, while giving the illusion that change is possible. The real revolutionist would have to deal with so-called problems in a unified way. There would have to be a merger between what appears to be the inner and the outer, a merger between what appears to be, even by my equation, the inner and the external. There has to be a continuing merger of this, and in a manner that goes far beyond any binary appearances. Now, what all that would come to, insofar as me offering a very short verbal conclusion to this, is that the true revolutionist would have damn little to say on the matter. And it would not be on the basis that he was trying to put up some, or present some imitation of Clint Eastwood, somebody who doesn't talk much. It is simply that the person would have damn little to say about so-called problems, but it would not be a pretext, it would not be a failure on his part in some way, it would not be as some parts of life's contemporary body would have it, it would not be a failure to stay on the male side of a man being able to, what do they call it, such things as externalize his deepest fears and feelings. He would not be an up-to-date fellow. He would not be the kind of guy that says, "Hi, I'm Ralph, and I'm your friend today." There would be almost nothing to say, that is, vis-a-vis the so-called problems. If you could actually experience the reality behind what I meant, of a kind of merger, a continuing merger of the apparently inward and the apparently external, then there would be no binary division between what ordinarily passes for being oneself and being one's problems. It's not a psychological story. It is not a psychic attempt to explain this in some new fashion. It is a molecular reality. There is a material connection, as much as the blood connects your liver and your heart, between what appears to be you, and then what you could define, what you describe as being your problems. But as long as they seem to be external, as long as they seem to be separate from oneself, then everything is stable. And any idea of change, I suggest to you, is an illusion, a necessary one, but change does not take place. You continue to, as politicians used to call it, you continue to fight the problem. I said politicians, I hadn't thought of that in years. It used to be an old gambling term. Fighting the table, fighting the cards. And then politicians started referring to it as fighting the problem instead of dealing with it. But it's not limited to a poker game or the halls of Congress. As long as there is a feeling that there is a separation between you and what seems to be your problems, which then I suggest to you by my second variation of the equation, make up one's life. As long as the so-called problems seem to be, or with ordinary people obviously are, external to you, you're fighting the problem. It's always there. The name of the problem may change in the same way that the hands may change. The cards that somebody else is holding changes from one deal to another. The apparent conflicts change from day to day according to what bills seem to be before the houses of the legislature. But there always seems to be a conflict. There always seems to be opposition. There always seems to be a, quote, problem. And it can't change as long as it apparently is external to you. As long as it is, one's life is obviously something other than oneself. That there's me and then there's life. And put them all together and they spell something. But life, the not I part, is clearly something other than oneself. As long as that's clear, then nothing's clear. As long as that's clear to you, you might as well be calling up Ray Charles or for writing lessons. Furthermore, as long as I got the equation up, let's take a fairly severe turn and try this one. The equation, in part, could be said to state the obvious. It could be looked at from one viewpoint as stating that A is A and B is B. But I would suggest that the real revolutionist, a few might be able to see, might be able to perceive this kind of equation to also say, not instead of, but to also say that A is also B and B A. I was afraid of that. All right? How about what humanity loves to talk about? Love. If we in some way now could speak of, quote, real love, whatever that might be, 4D love, I could point out to you that an absolute ad hoc working definition of real love would be A becoming B in spite of all 3D logic and limitations. And from there, it should be one short skip across the street for you to see that anything of any value would have to have the ability to be defined as A becoming B, as something being true in spite of all 3D logic and limitations. Were it not possible for apparently A to become an apparent B and vice versa, what would be worthwhile in the life of man? What would man be other than an animal that happened to have a thumb and a charge card and some clothes? He would be, as many sore asses and sore heads imagine, a poor work of art, life's cosmic joke and all that crap. He would be that. In other words, there would not even be small-time miracles. And by that I mean anything that would distinguish from a 3D view man from any other creature on this planet. Some more from the Revolutionist Handbook, if there was such a thing. Ordinarily, the crude and the uneducated make the best tyrants. That's even suspected out. Life has people in the ordinary world who have suspected that, but I'll cut the corners off suspicion and state it as a dictum that in the ordinary world, the crude and the uneducated make the best tyrants, but let's up the stakes. An even more extraordinary tyrant would be one who was indeed educated, sophisticated, dare I say hip, who could still address and deal with the populace in the familiar manner of a dolt. Think about it. Jump the parallel stream, jump back to apparently ordinary life. Let's pretend I'm just talking about ordinary affairs, that we're some sort of fifth column revolutionist, and then we're actually talking about the material world. With not a supremely cunning, I said extraordinary, because you do not ordinarily find this in life. Life has no need for it, but an extraordinary tyrant would not just be the run-of-the-mill, crude and uneducated. It'd be one who was suave, sophisticated, complex, educated, but could still deal with everybody else, the populace, those he had to deal with. He could address them, he could speak their language, and he could appear to them to be just the run-of-the-mill dolt. Now try and ponder why the hell I brought it up. As always, how could you find any significance and use of this kind of information against your own established partnership systems? Hurry up, think about it, damn it. All right, let's try it this way. Left to your ordinary devices, left to the runnings of your own system, your own internal voices, what is the basis? Just take the yellow circuit, the internal talk that has gone on all of your life. What is the internal yellow circuit basis, apparently, for attempted change? That the voices, the chemistry, the electricity in you that talks about change to some other part, the part it wants to change, how is it? It deals with it ordinarily, you don't notice, but it deals with it as though it were a crude, that is the part trying to change, or says it wants to change. It acts as though it is crude and uneducated. I say act. And it seems natural. If that were to, thank you, sister, brother, if that seems too sticky, look at it this way. Just under ordinary conditions, of you sitting around thinking, I should lose weight, I should quit smoking, I should quit eating so much, whatever it is. Internally, do you take on some pretentious voice? Do you suddenly begin to try and speak like George Sanders did or Orson Welles to yourself of, let's say that you were born and grew up somewhere outside of Birmingham. Do you suddenly try and sound as though you came from the Royal Shakespearean Company and you say to yourself, that self of you that smokes and eats too much and is lazy, do you say something like, see here, my good man? No, mechanically, automatically. You speak the same language. You're as though it is a would-be tyrant, just as crude, as uneducated, as doltish as those that he's addressing, as those he's attempting to persuade that those he may be threatening. Like, look here, if you don't stop smoking, you're going to die of lung cancer. If you don't stop eating so much, you're going to swell up and look like the Hindenburg. Internally, what seems to be some part of you and everybody else talking to some other part of you and everybody else, they speak the same language. The people of Louisiana get the Kingfisher. The people of Georgia got Herman Talmadge. The Germans got Hitler. Everybody gets the right would-be tyrant. I'm using tyrant to cover a multitude of sins. Ruler, governing body, would-be governing body, would-be controller. It speaks the proper language, and the proper language ordinarily is to be crude and unsophisticated. Remember, we're now attempting to talk about the internal affairs of you, not those simple Simon external affairs of the body politic. That the extraordinary condition would be if you could slip in a ringer. He apparently, or she apparently, is as crude, doltish, boorish, simplistic, vulgar as those with whom he or she has to deal, that is, oneself. But the secret being, what would make it extraordinary, is this apparent routine, plebeian dolt is actually very intelligent, very sophisticated, and knows what it's doing, that it is an act. I started out asking you to consider whether you could see it or not, but that would be an extraordinary circumstance. This is no importance, but just trust me if you don't get a glimpse of it, if you don't suspect it. If there was such a would-be tyrant or leader in the world, boy, talk about a ringer. And in fact, this kind of suspicion has gone on throughout history. Those of you, it's of no importance, but there are continuing little refrains of somebody here and there saying, boy, of course after the fact, but boy, wasn't Caesar, the original Caesar, wasn't he a work of art? Boy, wasn't he something? Did you ever read some of the things he wrote? Or Marcus Aurelius, or King so-and-so, or something that Constantine said, or somebody, the suspicion that, boy, there was a lot more to that person than he would let out due to the forces and circumstances of his office at the time. Right. And Hitler could have jumped, or Mussolini could have jumped off a balcony and flapped his little fat arms and flown too. He just didn't want to, I know. But as I said, there is that continuing kind of suspicion from some quarters in life's body. And of course, all suspicions are a reflection of something, at least of suspicions. What if, instead of you dealing with yourself on the same rough and tumble, crude basis, that it takes a dolt to lead a dolt, that it takes a boor to change a boor, much less a bub? What if you could deal with what seems to be the part of you that does not want to change, the part of you that is a crude, unwashed mass? That if you were smarter than it was, oh, I know that, that sounds like dreaming to most of you. Of course, for once, most of you are right. But what if? What if you were smarter than the rest of you? And what if the rest of you didn't know it? And the rest of you thought you were the same old dumbass that you've always been, that you're supposed to be? Of course, dumbass, I'm just being a smartass saying that you're still being yourself. All systems operational. All systems running just as they should run. The continuing conflict, the apparent conflict running, odd tempo. But what if there was a ringer involved? Of course, that's, again, part of what this is. If for nothing else, I am the stand-in, I'm the understudy for your ringer. Well, you must admit, I can appear to be as crude and as doltish as anybody. Assuming, of course, it's an act. I heard that. Which proves I am not completely without sophistication. Shows I am not completely sans suaveness and denabberness. Well, let's get down to the heart of where I was going to go tonight. It just so happens, since I was talking about ringers and tricking people, that we're back to that sort of place, because here is an area that in the past I have considered bringing in a marching band, strobe lights, making everyone fast for a couple of weeks, before I tried and relayed in words and otherwise this kind of information. But to hell with it, here it goes. As everyone should know, the capital R, real revolution is against established consciousness. But now I am going to tell you, and this is good for the month of July, the year 1987 at a bare minimum. I'm going to tell you what consciousness, ordinary consciousness is, and why it must be rebelled against. And I strongly recommend, if not insist, that you remember this definition, at least for this month, or as long as it stays true. Ordinary consciousness is the inability to think of more than one thing at a time. That is ordinary consciousness. That is what the revolution is against. I don't care whether the terms were my terms of revolution and consciousness, or if you were still using erstwhile religious allegories, if you were using philosophical parables. All of the definitions, all of the keywords, all of the catchwords, even after their translations, all the way from the Taoist writings, Confucius, good old Abraham and Moses, if you knew how to read it, Buddha, terms of enlightenment, Satori, being blown away, higher consciousness, freer consciousness, expanded awareness, an awakened state, all of that. All of their descriptions were attempting to convey the impression of what it would be to escape the ordinary condition. And they could have attributed this condition to a fall from grace, the power of demonic spirits, the lethargy of man, white sugar. But what they are unknowingly, what they have been unknowingly, I'm just wrapping it up for 1987 at least, been describing is a struggle against the inability, no matter your religion, no matter your intelligence, no matter your education, intelligence in the 3D sense. It is a struggle against the inability to think of more than one thing at once. And what life has had humanity dream of, muse about, ponder and poeticize regarding, would be if I could think of more than one thing at a time. A parenthetical note, at the very least, do not be misled and sit there and listen to your own voice and believe, well, wait, it's possible under ordinary conditions for me and other people to actually think of two things at once. Tut tut. You don't understand it. But lucky for you, I'm here. When it seems that ordinary consciousness might think of two things at once, it's always on this kind of basis. All right, I can think of two things. Now here's a kind of example. If you can listen fast enough, this covers it all. All right, I can think of two things at once. All right, here's two things covering it. I'm either going to crap out or I'm going to win. That is not thinking of two things. I'm either going to succeed, yeah, and I can think about it, I can picture it all right quick, I get little flashes, or else I'm going to fail. All right, that's two completely different things. And right now, faced with what I'm about to do, I'm about to throw the dice, I'm about to ask for the raise, I'm about to make a move on this woman or this man, whatever it is, I can think of two things at once. But that's one thing. The one thing you're thinking about is the, quote, winning/losing thing. That's one thing. The kind of attempt, the kind of continuing task that I have hidden behind such names as neuralizing. Can any of you get a glimpse of neuralizing as a threat, as an attempted threat? To severely strain this situation. It is a running threat. Well, if you don't readily see the connection, how about this? How about the old ideas? Sometimes they are translated into English as Zen teachings, Zen attempts to clear one's mind, to not think of anything. If that were possible, that would be an improvement. If that were possible in the 3D world, it would in fact be the same thing. Anybody who could think of nothing could think of more than one thing at a time. Can you see that neuralizing is a continuing, as long as you attempt to do it, threat to strain this situation to the absolute breaking point by being able to remember something without thinking about it? See, I never just said that what you're supposed to do is not think about anything. But to be able to remember something without thinking about it. Because if you could do that, then you could remember something without thinking about it solely. Because to begin with, you've got to remember not to simply think about it. And so there, I've already got you. You'd be thinking about two things at once if you could do it. And if you could do that for a period of time that I won't define, but it will calculate on your watch, it would absolutely stretch the breaking point, what seems to be the difference, what seems to be the separation between being able to think of nothing, being able to think of more than one thing at a time, or, if you prefer, being able to remember something without thinking about it, or be able to think about more than that one thing or any other thing at one time. 4D consciousness, revolutionary consciousness, would be the ability to consistently think of a simultaneous plurality of things and processes, but not simply thinking that, yeah, a coin has two sides. I can think that. What's the big deal? I can stand right here and think that if I walk over to her and whip a line on her, I can stand right here and I can picture. That is, I can think of her saying, "Oh, how nice," smiling and saying, "Won't you sit down?" And almost simultaneously, I can also picture. That is, I can think of her going, "Come on, give me a break." But that is not thinking of two things. That is not thinking of more than one thing at a time. That is the one thing. That is binary consciousness. That for every head there is a tail. For every winner there is a loser. For every winning situation there is a losing possibility. 4D consciousness would be able to continually think of simultaneous pluralities of things and processes. But it would not be limited to the binary outcome of some specific game having to do with some specific something or process. That I will either make a favorable impression or I will not. I will either crap out or I'll win the fight. I will either succeed or I will fail. That's one thing. That is one binary dynamic. That's thinking of one thing. Anybody can do that. To be able to think of that, take winning and losing. Take being shot down or being accepted. Take that as being ad hoc C and D possibilities. 4D consciousness would be that C and D you take as being one at the ordinary level. All right, I can think of that, but I can simultaneously, as much as physically possible for my brain to do, I can also simultaneously think of oodles and noodles of E's, things that have nothing to do with this crap game. The original way to approach this is to look at the E possibility as equaling time. We'll get it on the other side of the tape. The kind of struggle, what it would take, the kind of campaign that you should be on if you were a real revolutionist, to develop 4D consciousness, 4D sight. This kind of struggle would be necessary for the revolutionist to properly, to plan, to reconnoiter, to be able to execute any revolution. Of course, those of you really in the know understand we're not talking about a revolution out in the street. We're talking about affecting a dramatic change in your genetic makeup, a reshaping of your very being while you're alive. We're in all questions of change or guilt or fear and etc. We're like ducks off of a water's back. It's like ducks off of a water buffalo. It's like backs off of a wet... Well, you know what I mean. What would be truly 4D sight? What would be 4D consciousness? There are, of course, limits in the 3D world to words, but by God, some of you should be able to hear this by now. You can hear beyond the words. 4D consciousness, 4D sight, would be the consistent ability to be conscious of time, stretched through, stretched across all the other dimensions. And you can take whatever terms your own partnership, your own system believes that it has read and heard about in times past of enlightenment, awakening, etc. And they all, again, I suggest to you most strongly, they all fit within this 1987 description I'm giving you. I'm just calling it 4D sight. That at the very minimum, no matter if these people that seem to have accidentally experienced such moments, or have experienced such moments and do not know what to do with it, can't go back to it, all the things of life playing around with its own mind and has let people do this. They're the ones that primarily write about it and attempt to talk about it. But no matter if they attribute it to spiritual forces, to gods, mythical creatures, dead Indians, people from Venus talking to them, they're all talking about the same thing when they try and describe this extraordinary, to say the very least, state. What they saw, what they experienced was all of the ordinary dimensions, but for some period of time a constant awareness of time itself. Time itself is fibers in a tapestry running through all of this without beginning and without end. That carries with it, at the very least, for the few moments, the few hours that relatively ordinary people experience such things sometimes, even without them having the ability to analyze it, not having the need to. They're not set up to do it. It's just almost a passing experiment that life engaged in. But even without them having any need to analyze it, to talk about it, to try and stabilize it and remember it and etc., they do experience a kind of at least tacit sensation, thusly, as it's expressed sometimes, that time changes everything. Time cures all wounds. Time is the great illusion. Time is God. Some weeks back, when I was still using the parables about, or the paradigmatic pictures of revolutionary conditions, established powers, conspiracy theories, does anybody recall I pointed out to you that from one three-dimensional view, the powerful, the reality of there being humans, anthropoids within the grid of life structure within life's own body, that there has always been a strain. There is a power chain that goes on consistently, although control seems to change hands externally. And nations are up, nations are down. The stocks of Citibank are up, then they're down. Then the Bank of America's up. Then the dollar drops compared to the yen. Then the yen drops compared to the Deutschmark. But behind all of this throughout history, there is a chain of power. In the same way that there is a chain of healthy power within an individual, genetically, assuming that you do have any healthy power chain in you. Life has one. You could be part of its gorder, but we won't go into that either. In passing, I've said something to the effect that the difference between what would be, if there was a material reality to the dreams of conspiratorial theories, then these great hidden conspirators, the powerful that actually run everything, if there was such, the main difference between the powerful and the powerless, that is, you and everybody else, would be that these mechanically powerful, quote, individuals, families, hereditary strains, that they are born with an awareness of time being a necessary, a usable, a profitable dimension, and everybody else is not. Bricklayers don't consider time as being a dimension. Ordinary people do not. Time is what's on a watch. Time is what you got to put up with to work. Time is what you got to watch for if you're not going to get docked pay. Time is what you argue about if your wife is late meeting you somewhere. Time is what the ditch digger bitches about when they tell him he's got to work over it. And he ain't going to be paid time and a half for it. But there is no consistent consciousness in ordinary people of time being a consistent dimension. If there were, ordinary people would have no faith in the past. They would see that the only good thing that you can say about the ordinary perception of the future is that it never arrives. Ordinary people could have no faith in the appearance of things. They could have no faith in words. The passing snide remarks that are oftentimes made in life, that sometimes a man will say something and later he may say the same thing and not mean it. Well, like the belief in mendacity. Anybody finally look that up? Lying. Believing that there's such a thing as lying. That hypocrisy is something that actually is real, like a kumquat. And it's something to be avoided, perhaps like a kumquat. Ordinary consciousness would no longer have any faith in, could not depend upon any stable reality. Because there would be the threads holding this tapestry together, that everything, the tempo is at a different speed. It is so different from ordinary consciousness. It is similar to what I was mentioning last week of people not being ordinary conscious, not being able to see the ultimate conspirator, life, because its face is so large. You just can't see it. Last week of people not being ordinary conscious, not being able to see the ultimate conspirator, life, because its face is so large. You just can't see it. In that same sort of way, ordinary people could not see time. They could not see us working at a different tempo, that everything they look at is unstable. Everything they look at is going to die. Not just people, not just their family, but what appears to be the truth. What they take as being spiritual truth, cosmic truth. There's no such thing. What appears to be the stability, the concrete nature of reality is not true. But all of that can sound fairly speculative, but it's on the basis of so-called human relationships, and on the basis of what seems to be one's own relationship to oneself, that I am a stable entity. I've got to be. I've got to stabilize myself. In fact, I'm not stable enough. I can't depend on me. But more or less, apparently, I can depend on me. I'm always the same person, more or less. I may be moody, but I look in the mirror, I answer the same name. I have the same complaints about me. I still have the same bad habits. I may be now 40, fat, and fatigued, but I'm more or less what I was when I was 20. If I'm real serious, I'm more or less the same thing I was when I was 15. I just weigh more. I can afford more bad habits. I don't have that many people now, the same people that can tell me what to do. But there's not that much difference. In the old dude, there is, but ordinary consciousness cannot see it. That time is the continuing dimension. That first amongst equals in the 3D world that I could verbally describe or care to at this time, that is the unseen dimension. That is what would make the difference. That is what would facilitate any possible change, any possible revolution. Not just the glacial, small, as far as one lifetime, alterations that come about through mechanical evolution, but through what people are attempting to do with this sort of thing as an internal, as a personal revolution. Without a continuing sense, without a continuing consciousness of time being just as important as height, width, depth, weight, color, fatigue, fullness, emptiness, whatever else you think is important. Without a continuing awareness that time is always there, and that nothing is the same, nothing is stable. Without that, you cannot change. Without that, you cannot join the revolution. You can't even plot it. You cannot even correctly reconnoiter it. And of course, then, you certainly cannot execute any plans that might help facilitate a revolution. You're left working in the mines, listening to a radio. Sometimes it seems like it's tuned into me, but you're still listening to a goddamn radio. And you can get those for $3.95 at Radio Shack. Plus, they'll tell you the time. But you got to admit, it's more than I've ever done for you. No, I'll tell you this, it's way too late for some things, and it's still a little bit early for some others. The only problem is a revolutionist is not welcome in any waiting room anywhere. Not at the bus depot, not at the train depot. Nowhere do they like a revolutionist to hang around. And it does no good to simply say, if a revolutionist was so dumb to show his hand, and to say like, well, I'm a little late for so-and-so, like I was a little late for the last bus. Or to say, well, I'm a little early, I guess, for the train I was waiting on. You can't be either. All of that indicates a severe dependence upon 3D consciousness, because you think that time is something. Time is something that stops. Time is something that's stable. It just is. It just is in the same way that since life had, for instance, Christians come up with this great idea, well, Hindus and Christians and everybody else, but since there's more of you that had a Christian background than a Hindu one, the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the great Trinity. And nobody can ever explain the third one. The Hindus can't explain their third one. They seem to be a little more genetically enigmatic than Westerners, and so they can just kind of go, well, who knows? But the Christians end up, people writing dissertations, getting PhDs from schools of theology, yeah, that's right, by trying to explain all the way from St. Augustine to everybody else, what in the hell did it mean these people kept referring to that third one? I mean, it's just all that the Yellow Circuit can do to make out, all right, listen, we had gods. The Greeks, everybody, the Sumerians, everybody had gods. And then come along this story that it's not just the God, it's not just a Kronos or a Zeus. Now we got the God, Jehovah. And then he had a son. He made a son. He split off a son. And that's hard enough for ordinary Yellow Circuit. But then, to throw in this third one, and nobody knows what the third one does, where it came from, what its name is. I mean, for instance, I include you people in. We've not only got the Son, we know God is Larry. But the Holy Spirit, nobody knows his name, where he lives, what he does. But he's just always hovering about through these so-called holy scriptures of the Western world. Always kind of lurking in the background, and every now and then in these holy writings, Old and New Testament, is these threats like, you better watch out for the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit will get you when you least expect it. And that kind of thing. And don't fuck with the Holy Spirit, except nobody knows what it is. All right, I can define it for you ad hoc, or at least point to you in the E direction. But I can also point to you that it is time. But also look in the religions, or back to our Western religions, Christianity specifically. All these stories, the Old and New Testament, the stories about God and then Jesus. But the whole thing of defining a God or a godlike person, what's one of the definitions? What's one of the descriptions? He's the same today as he was yesterday, and he'll be the same forever. God, how comforting. The Yellow Circuit just goes, shoo. I've been an atheist, but on a hot day, that almost makes me want to join the church, just to know that somebody, something, somewhere is unchanging. So certainly there is no place for a description of this other part, this enigmatic Holy Spirit, to say, well, what it is forever changing. Its name is, hey, stand back and watch me change. Or step forward and try and stop me from changing. You can make no sense in the 3D world. Never make any sense, any useful so-called logic out of dealing with two apparent forces, whether they were called good and evil, Mutt and Jeff, up and down, X and Y, Soupy and Sales. It doesn't matter. You can make no sense of. You cannot start a revolution fueled by any, quote, understanding, knowledge, use of two forces. Nothing makes any sense. You cannot see anything correctly without a continuing 4D sight wherein life is permeated by, is stretched across time consistently. Not Yellow Circuit definition of past, divisions into past, present, and future. Not a watch. Not the movements of the sun as opposed to the planet Earth, but absolute time. That is the unstable, the forever changing nature of everything. The reality of verbs over nouns, the reality of processes over things. Without a constant awareness of time, everything apparently becomes nouns. To human consciousness, anything that seems to be of any value can be reduced to being a noun, a thing. And its importance can be seen in ordinary consciousness. That is, I can only think of one thing at a time. But by God, I only think of things that are important. And right now, me thinking about revenge is important. Me thinking about jealousy is important. Me thinking about poverty is important. Me thinking about life after death is important. Me thinking about death is really important. As long as you are a victim of ordinary consciousness, that is, the inability to think of more than one thing at one time, then time appears to be salami that you can cut up. You can cut it up, you can repackage it, you might be able to trade around with it, you can pray for the guides to give you more, you can pray for the guides to cut down on the machine, to not slice it so thin, to not let you get so close to the blade. Well, all that's the basis of fearing death, believing that there is another life just like this. Well, like this, but a whole lot better, of course, after you die. All of that is an ignorance of time. It is, this is harder to describe, but it's a fear of time. It's an unrecognized fear that seems to be obvious once I put it in words, or anybody to say, well, it's a fear of dying. It's a fear of change. It's a fear of time. The unsaid part is, no matter if somebody apparently is speaking in religious terms, philosophical terms, prayerful terms, hopeful terms, to talk about death, to talk about the possibility of surviving death, to talk about the need for one to live an upright life as the guides intended, so that, of course, that the payoff will be forthcoming after you buy a yield farm. All of that can be described another way. It's a fear of time, because at the very least, the unsaid recognition is, given enough, what, time, I'm going to get it. Given enough time, I will no longer be here as I am now. Given enough time, I won't even feel as good as I feel now. Given enough time, as poor a specimen as I may be now physically, I'll be even worse. Given enough time, as little as I'm liked now by those who actually know me, given enough time, probably strangers will begin to hate me. There is no greater fear than of time, except it's not called that. It's not seen as that. I was mentioning last week people, as you are, more or less, not actually being responsible for attempting to be the revolutionist 100% of the time, but at those times when you do remember and make such effort, it should be on the basis of 100% of your attention and your possible effort and your expenditure of energy at that time. Then I could say at those times, at those instances, that you should be devoting 100% of your attention and energy right then to whatever efforts you can make. Those efforts presently should be the campaign to see time. Of course, if any of you get this, then let's scratch time. I don't, because you think you know what it is. It's to see, you know what, the T word, the T reality. It's to be able to see that. To see that it is a non-ending, that it is non-endingly stretched through, pulled across, an inseparable part of all other dimensions. If you could do that, then you would be revolting correctly against established consciousness, because then you would not be limited to the ability to only think of one thing at a time. Very good. Because as long as, in a sense, that you are time blind, it is like the salami. I can only think of one thing at a time. I mean, it just seems obvious. I've got this time right now to think of something, all right? Now I got this time, there's another second, I can think of something else. But that's the belief that time are slices of salami. It's the same way that ordinary consciousness must divide up, select, categorize, name everything. That's the only way that ordinary consciousness makes, quote, any sense out of anything. What if it all ran together? You could describe ordinary consciousness also as being looked at from a more positive view, if you must. This ordinary consciousness is man's supreme ability not to have everything all run together at once. So if I was trying to take your sense of ordinary consciousness as it is and say, wait a minute, what if you could take what you are now, and instead of you looking out there and seeing people, you see things, and you can think about one thing and then think about something else, you can compare things. What if suddenly all of your existence, not only I, but suddenly what seems to be the division between not I? What if this was like a great watercolor and suddenly it rained on it, and all of this just kind of ran together? Well, hey, give me a break. To an ordinary person, they'd think, hey, insanity. I know what I'd call that. I'd call that a brain drain. I would call that bad news. I don't want any part of that. Well, at least thankfully it cannot be forced upon you. But I must suggest to you that all of the dreams you've had fall somewhere within that kind of description. Then and only then does any of this begin to, forgive me, make sense. That the consciousness of the bourgeoisie, that is all of us, at line level, the consciousness is wired up. And apparently the attempt of education itself is to keep all of this from running together, is to produce educated, keen-eyed men and women, taste, the ability to critique, the ability to tell the wheat from the chaff, real art from fake art, real ideas from bad ideas, good people from bad people, good habits from perhaps not so good habits. Then what else is human consciousness if it is not the ability to discern between the good and the better? Having it all run together doesn't sound right, does it? Well, you can look at it this way, if possible. That sure would take care of, let me understate it, a lot of the partnership's apparent inquiries into the nature of life. If it all just kind of ran together. And you recognize that this is the way it's always been, but due to my keen mind, due to the fact that I finally got my GED, due to the fact that I indeed took some night courses, got my IQ up to over my shoe size, and due also to my ability to be very critical of everybody and everything, I am just at the point now that I feel as though well, I'm not sure, but I feel very secure in the fact that I might, and I probably could. What if it all ran together? What if you could see that it's all been running together? That is the nature of being alive, that there is no peace. There is no stability in the land of the living. But ordinary consciousness, part of its job, 3D sight, part of its job is to look out and you see individual people. You see Gary, you see Sue, you see Jerry Ann, and they're different people. You see people with different tastes. You see people with different backgrounds, different colors, different opinions. And you see people, ordinary consciousness, you see people as being whos. That there's somebody inside. There's a little Ed inside of Ed. There's a little Jane inside of a Jane. And therefore you got to worry about hypocrisy, misdirection, mendacity. You got to worry about people's unconscious motivations. You got to wonder, can I trust this person? If you had the correct 4D sight about yourself, there are no heroes, there are no villains, there's nobody fascinating. People are what they do. There are no secrets in anybody. There are no little people down in people. There are no Zorks in the yellow circuits or anywhere else. There are no little demons. There are no little good guys. Nobody is inside of anybody plotting. And anybody who believes that, I mean, that's a dead giveaway. If I wasn't mystical already and could be able to look at everybody on this planet and just immediately see them for what they are. If it wasn't for that, all you got to do is find out if they believe. I'll give it to you easy and I'll give it to you harder. To see if they believe in any way in an unconscious mind, unconscious motivations, the ability even to have conscious motivations. That this person over here, I just suggested an idea that we do something. I just gave them the germ of an idea, and now they're looking off, and there's somebody inside of them, and they're plotting possibilities. They're thinking about more than one thing at one time. They may even be considering how they can cheat me out of this. They are probably considering how they can appear to go along with me while actually doing so. As long as anybody, if I didn't have other mystical abilities, as long as anybody has any faith, which includes almost everybody on this planet, in that, that'd be all you need to know. If you knew anything already, of course. Because then you'd realize those people do not understand duck squat. Those people are the salt of the earth. Those are my kind of people. God, I could tyrannize these people, or conversely, come terrorize me. We are a tailor-made audience and entertainer. You're my kind of people. Dolts. 3D people. Ordinary people. I'm not being insulting. If you were devoting 100% of your energy at any time to any of this, right now, I'm telling you again, in conclusion, it should be in the campaign to attempt to develop 4D sight, a continuing awareness of time as being an equal member of what appears to be this three-dimensional reality. To say the very least, it is an equal member with everything else. But it is not slices, not just salami, it's not even bologna. And to keep in mind what I've described to you, an established consciousness, the very thing that you are attempting to revolt against, is the inability to think of more than one thing at a time. As long as you can't do that, you don't have to wonder how you're doing. You ain't. But just think, if in some way you really fucked up and you could think of more things than one at a time, you realize, I must admit, the terrible damage this could do. You realize what it would do to your present inner life. And many of you have partnerships that believe that your inner life is a rolling filigree, a dancing fleur-de-lis, a cosmic Ringling Brothers. Think what it would do to your ability to be mad, to be critical. Think what it would do to your ability to experience, dare I say it, sure, to experience, to continue to experience, every day, salt of the earth, human emotion. Thank God all talk of revolution, of course, is a dream. Thank God we live under conditions that even if you don't recognize it are so oppressive, are so controlled, there's just hardly no chance of any revolution. Oh, sure, it's easy enough for you to sit here and for me to talk about it. Thank God it's almost functionally impossible. Or else I might drive you all crazy and it might all run together. And then you'd want to try and come and find me and thank me, and you can't do it. Now, Wiener Schnitzel. You people out of town, I will safely assume that by now everyone got the messages I sent 2 weeks ago regarding your responsibility. I consider this to be of absolute, unconditional importance, and I unconditionally expect everyone to participate in their proportionate manner, week in and week out, and with no exceptions. I have and continue to enjoy reading all that's been sent in for consideration of the magazine here. And I've turned it over to the magazine committee, and I also would assume that due to the time lag and due to the logistics involved, that it's not as simple, or it may not prove to be as simple as to work in immediately all of the other city submissions as it will be to deal with material homegrown. Did you understand that? I think so. For you people out of town and you people here, down here we're involved right now, the people are with the history and the great books and the geography and other miscellaneous. But you people out of town and you people here who have spare moments, I had a small task for you. I would like for you to write. If you really enjoy it, you can send me a copy. For you people out of town, the week after you have a chance to do this, if you'd like to, and some of you want to after the meeting, after seeing that week's tape, those of you who want to in other cities, if you're delighted with what you did, you might stand up and have a little postscript to your meeting and read some of these. What it is, I'd like for you to write a very passionate, we're talking about on a horizontal level apparently, just what would appear to be an everyday occurrence as an everyday person. Write a passionate, angry letter to an editor, and if the paper were going to put a caption, there would be, "Whatever happened to common courtesy?" One fairly recent that came to my memory of a similar vein was somebody was writing, and it was on the basis of whatever happened to just everyday common courtesy, and some person was mentioning how they were staying at a public phone booth in an airport, and they were talking to some relative in very important long distance, and some guy kept standing here and tapping his foot and all this, and the person finally said, they turned to the person and said, "Do you really need to phone this bed?" And the person said, "Yes." And so they said, "Well, I'll call you back in a minute, Mom." And they hung up and let this person have it. And this guy got on the phone and he made 3 or 4 calls, just real short calls and just taking his time. And the person finally said, "Well, I thought it was something important, that you had to do. I'll let you use the phone, sir." And said the man just got indignant as hell and said, "Well, I didn't know I had to have your permission to use a public phone at an airport." Whatever happened to common courtesy? I would also hope that all you people out of town, even you people that wonder about all of this at times, you do understand that this is, whether you see it immediately or not, pregnant with potential in another direction. Just the apparent basis of it, the material basis of it, is writing a letter like something you just got to make up an occurrence. I hope you'll make it up. God forbid it's something that actually happened to you and you remembered it that way. But on the basis that you're writing to an editor, "Dear sirs, let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you what I observed," in the basis of it being whatever happened, that common courtesy. I mean, have it the kind that you're waving your hat and throwing it in the floor and going to stomp on it. You're foaming. Get that kind of horizontal 3D venom and outrage in your little 3D pen as you write it. Those of you that may have limited experience and exposure to all this, let me add, if you find yourself writing this, if you read it over later and it begins to, as it were, stir your blood, that you begin to actually inflame yourself, you are not, I repeat, you are not to read yours to everybody else. Nay, you're not to even bring yours to the meeting. I don't ever want to hear about it. I want you to take it and go into a closet, and I want you to ponder what's going on. And I want you to duly suffer over it and feel repentant. You don't have to do all that, but just don't read it and don't bring it. That's all for out of town.